In 2008, an agricultural engineer drove into Fillmore County, Minnesota, with $180,000 worth of GPS precision technology and a promise. His system would optimize every row, every pass, every acre. The mathematics were flawless. The software was perfect. The elevation data was accurate to within 6 inches. Then came the worst autumn rains in 17 years, and on 4 of his GPS-optimized farms, the topsoil started moving. 3 to 5 tons per acre, gone in weeks. He drove past one farm that hadn't lost a single inch. An old man was standing at the edge of the field, watching the water. He'd been watching it for 50 years, and the water had been telling him everything. This is what it said. Fillmore County, Minnesota, autumn 2008. There is a kind of knowledge that lives only in the body, in the specific angle of a wrist, in the way a man's eyes travel across a hillside and register, without conscious calculation, the invisible lines along which water will move when the sky opens up. It cannot be downloaded. It cannot be encoded in an algorithm. It can barely be taught in words, because the words are always one step behind the understanding. The understanding is older than language. It belongs to the hands and the eyes and the feet that have walked the same ground across 50 seasons of rain. Otto Breckner had that knowledge. He was 77 years old in the autumn of 2008, and he had been farming the same 160 acres of rolling Karst limestone upland in the southeastern corner of Fillmore County since 1958, when his father handed him the operation and retired to a house in Preston with a bad back and a lifetime of opinions about how the soil should be treated. Otto's father had learned contour farming from his own father, a German immigrant who had arrived in Minnesota in 1901 and who had, according to family memory, refused to plow straight lines on sloped ground. From the very first season, not because anyone had told him to contour, but because he had watched water run down a straight furrow on a German hillside in his childhood and understood, with the clarity of direct observation, what straight furrows did to soil when rain came hard and fast. 3 generations of Breckners had plowed their fields along the contours of the land-curved rows that followed the natural elevation lines of the Karst topography, rows that slowed water rather than channeling it, rows designed not to maximize machine efficiency, but to mimic the way the landscape itself preferred to handle rainfall. It was inconvenient farming. The rows curved and bent according to the land's own geometry, which meant no two were exactly the same length, which meant the headlands were irregular, which meant every turn required judgment rather than repetition. Modern GPS-guided tractors hated irregular headlands. Otto didn't use GPS. He used his eyes. Fillmore County, Minnesota, is not ordinary farm country. It is the heart of Minnesota's Karst region, a landscape underlaid by soluble limestone and dolomite bedrock that has been dissolving for millions of years, leaving behind more than 10,000 sinkholes, underground drainage systems, and caves. The surface soil sits above this porous bedrock like a skin stretched over a honeycomb, and when that skin erodes, it does not recover. Karst soil loss is permanent in a way that flatland erosion is not, because the subsoil beneath it is not more soil, it is rock. Lose the topsoil in Fillmore County and you have not degraded a field. You have ended it. This fact was not a theoretical concern in 2008. It was the central reality of farming on the county's rolling uplands, where slopes of 3 to 8% dropped away from ridge crests, toward creek valleys in patterns that had been carved by the Root River and its tributaries across 10,000 years of glacial meltwater and seasonal snowmelt. The farmers who had worked this ground for generations understood it. Many of the farmers who arrived in the 1980s and 1990s, drawn by relatively low land prices and the promise of new technology, did not. Craig Melton drove into Fillmore County in the first week of September, 2008 inches. A company truck loaded with equipment that represented, as he would later describe it, the state-of-the-art in precision agricultural optimization. He was 38 years old, a graduate of Iowa State University's agricultural engineering program, and he had spent the previous 6 years working for Agritech Solutions, a Des Moines-based consulting firm that sold GPS-guided farming systems to operations across the upper Midwest. The system he carried a combination of RTK GPS receivers, digital elevation model software, and variable rate application controllers had a sticker price of $180,000 for the full installation package, and it had been deployed on more than 200 farms in Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin, with results that the company's marketing materials described as yield optimization of 12 to 22% in the first full season. The 2008 financial crisis had hit the agricultural sector with particular severity in Minnesota. Commodity prices, which had spiked sharply in early 2008 on the back of biofuel demand and export growth, had collapsed in the second half of the year as credit markets froze and global demand contracted. Corn had peaked at $7.88 per bushel in June and fallen below $4 by November. Soybean prices followed a similar trajectory. Farmers who had borrowed heavily against the high prices to purchase equipment, rent additional ground, or expand operations found themselves in the autumn of 2008 holding debt loads that the new price environment could not service. Farm bankruptcy filings across the upper Midwest were climbing toward levels not seen since the early 2010s recovery from the same crisis. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis was already tracking the early indicators. In this environment, a technology that promised 12 to 22% yield improvement had obvious appeal. Craig Melton had been busy all summer. He had closed contracts with 4 farms in Fillmore County alone, and he had 2 more appointments scheduled for the second week of September, when his GPS unit led him, on a Tuesday morning, past the entrance to Otto Breckner's farm on County Road 4. He almost didn't stop. The Breckner place did not look like a technology sale. The farmhouse was a 1920s 2-story, with a covered porch and a kitchen garden along the south wall. The equipment shed held a 1,987 John Deere 4,450, and a row of implements that Melton estimated averaged at least 20 years in age. The corn in the field east of the barn was not planted in the straight, GPS-optimized rows that Melton's eye had been trained to see as the baseline of a well-managed operation. The rows curved. They followed what appeared to be some irregular, idiosyncratic logic that bore no relationship to the field's rectangular boundaries. Melton pulled into the driveway anyway. He was thorough, and something about the curving rows caught his attention not with admiration, exactly, but with the professional curiosity of an engineer confronting a system he couldn't immediately classify. Otto was sharpening a disc blade in the equipment shed when Melton introduced himself. He listened to the pitch with the patient, non-committal attention of a man who has heard many pitches in many decades and has developed, through long experience, the ability to hear the silence underneath the words. When Melton finished, Otto set down the whetstone and said, "Walk with me." They walked the east field together, Otto moving slowly but with the unhurried certainty of a man navigating his own living room in the dark. He stopped at a point roughly 2/3 of the way up the main slope, where the field's gradient shifted from approximately 4% to approximately 6%, and pointed downhill. After a heavy rain, he said, "Show me where the water goes." Melton looked at the field. The contour rows followed the slope's curvature at this point in a gentle arc that bent away from the steepest line of descent. He could see now that he was looking for it, that the furrows between the rows formed a series of shallow, interrupted channels that would slow downhill water movement rather than concentrating it. But his mind was working in straight lines, and the field's geometry was not straight. "The GPS system accounts for slope," Melton said. "The software generates an optimized field plan from LiDAR elevation data. It places the row lines at calculated intervals to balance yield across variable soil zones." "That's not what I asked," Otto said. "I asked where the water goes." Melton looked at the field again and did not answer. Otto crouched down slowly, the way a 77-year-old man crouches on a hillside, and picked up a handful of soil from the ridge of the nearest contour row. He held it out to Melton. It was dark, loose, and visibly rich, a warm brown-black that the agricultural world calls A-horizon topsoil, the living layer produced by centuries of organic decomposition and microbial activity, the layer that makes farming possible. It crumbled between Otto's fingers and released the specific, unmistakable smell of healthy soil, what scientists call petrichor, and what farmers simply call the good smell. "This is the same soil my grandfather plowed in 1928, Otto said. 80 years, same field, same depth of topsoil. He let it fall. How deep is the A-horizon on the farms your system is running?" Melton did not have that number available for Fillmore County specifically. "I know the number for mine," Otto said. 14 inches. It was 14 inches in 1928. It is still 14 inches. That is not an accident. He stood up and looked at Melton with an expression that was not unkind and not dismissive and not particularly interested in winning an argument. "Your machine is very good at telling the tractor where to go," he said. "But the tractor still goes in rows, and the rows still go somewhere. The question is whether where they go matches where the water goes. Your machine reads the elevation. That's good. But elevation is not the same as drainage. Drainage is what happens to water that falls on a specific piece of ground, in a specific rain, when the soil is at a specific level of saturation. That changes by the season, by the year, by what you planted last fall. No elevation map from last year tells you what this field will do in October this year. Water will tell you. You just have to watch it." The autumn of 2008 inches, southeastern Minnesota, was the wettest on record since 1991. September and October together delivered 11.4 inches of rainfall, nearly double the long-term average for those 2 months, arriving in a pattern of repeated heavy events rather than steady accumulation, the meteorological equivalent of pouring a bucket of water on a table rather than letting it rain in gently from a watering can. Each event saturated the soil before it could drain from the previous event, progressively reducing the soil's infiltration capacity and increasing the proportion of rainfall that became surface runoff rather than percolation. For farms with GPS-optimized precision tillage, this rainfall pattern exposed a structural vulnerability that the technology's designers had not fully anticipated. The problem was this: GPS precision farming systems in 2008 generated their field plans from digital elevation models. DEM data derived from aerial LiDAR surveys flown the previous year or, in some cases, several years prior. These models were accurate to within approximately 10 to 15 centimeters of elevation across the field surface. For the purpose of placing row lines parallel to elevation contours, this accuracy was theoretically sufficient. In practice, on Fillmore County's Karst uplands, it was not. Karst topography is irregular at a scale below the resolution of any DEM available in 2008. The limestone bedrock beneath the soil surface had been dissolved unevenly over thousands of years, creating subtle subsurface depressions, underground drainage channels, and microtopographic variation that did not appear in any LiDAR survey because the survey saw only the surface. A field that appeared uniform at 1.5-centimeter resolution might contain a dozen invisible subsurface drainage paths that influenced surface water movement in ways that no algorithm could detect without knowing what lay beneath. Otto knew what lay beneath. He had been walking that ground for 50 years, and he had watched water move across it in every kind of rain: slow, soaking autumn rains, fast, violent summer thunderstorms, the long snowmelt of March, and he had read those movements the way a doctor reads a pulse, not as data points but as a continuous narrative about the health of the land. His contour rows did not follow the GPS-calculated optimal elevation intervals. They followed the water. Over 50 years of observation, he had learned which ridgelines concentrated runoff in heavy rain, which swales acted as natural drainage corridors, which areas of the field had subsurface connections to the karst drainage system below. His rows intercepted water in the places where it moved fastest and redirected it along paths that kept it on the field long enough to infiltrate rather than run off. It was not a system he could have written down. It was a map drawn in action. In the turning of the plow year after year on ground, he understood as intimately as he understood his own hands. On the 4 precision-farmed fields in Fillmore County where Craig Melton had installed his system that summer, the autumn rains of 2008 did what uncontrolled water does to tilled soil on a karst slope. They found the paths the rows had left open for them. The first call came from a farmer named Dennis Haugen, who farmed 240 acres on the south-facing slope above Whitewater Creek. Melton drove out on October 14th, 2 days after a 8-inch rain event, and found what he later described in his field notes as significant rill erosion along the eastern headland, extending approximately 180 feet downslope from the ridgecrest. Estimated soil loss in affected zone 3 to 5 tons per acre. Rill erosion is the formation of small channels, rills where concentrated surface water has carried away the topsoil in thin but devastating strips. On a field where the A horizon measures 8 inches in depth and the underlying B horizon is subsoil clay, unsuitable for crop production, a rill 2 inches deep represents a 25% loss of productive soil capacity. On karst uplands, where the A horizon may measure only 4 to 6 inches over limestone bedrock, a 2-inch rill may expose rock. Haugen's east field was showing rills, 3 of them, running parallel to each other down the steepest axis of the slope, each approximately 2 inches deep and 8 to 14 inches wide. The GPS row lines, optimized for yield distribution based on last year's DEM, had inadvertently created a channel pattern that concentrated rather than dispersed the October rainfall. The second call came from 2 farms in the western part of the county. Then a third. Melton spent 2 weeks driving between damaged fields, measuring erosion, documenting losses, and trying to understand what had happened. He ordered updated LiDAR data from the county GIS office and spent evenings overlaying it against his system's row placement calculations. The mathematics were correct. The elevation data were accurate within their stated parameters. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was not in the system. The problem was in what the system could not see. He drove back to County Road 4 on the last day of October. The Breckner field east of the barn was standing clean. The October rains had come and gone, and the soil surface between the curved contour rows showed no rills. No concentrated erosion channels, no evidence that several tons of topsoil had been carried away by surface water. The soil was dark and intact and smelled, even in late October, of health rather than loss. Otto was closing up the equipment shed for the evening when Melton arrived. He listened without interrupting while Melton explained what had happened on the other farms. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything for a full 30 seconds after Melton finished. Then he said, "Come back Thursday morning. Bring rain boots. I'll show you something." What Otto showed Craig Melton on the first Thursday of November 2008 was not a technology and not a formula. It was a way of seeing. They spent 4 hours walking the Breckner farm and 3 neighboring properties in the early morning after a half-inch overnight rain, enough to create visible surface water movement without triggering the destructive runoff of a heavy event. Otto moved through the wet fields slowly, stopping every 100 feet or so to watch, to point, to explain in plain language what the water was doing and why. "Here," he said, "at a swale between 2 low ridges, the water from the ridge above collects. In a heavy rain, this is where you get concentrated flow. So the row here," he pointed to one of his curved furrows, "turns to face it, slows it down, spreads it out. Nothing fancy, but it took me 15 years to learn this corner." He moved downslope. "Here, the bedrock is close to the surface, 2 feet, maybe 2.5. In dry years, it doesn't matter. But in wet years, the soil above it saturates fast and water starts moving on top of the rock. If your row runs with the slope here, you lose this topsoil in one bad rain. So the row turns across the slope. Sharp turn, ugly row. But the soil is still here after 50 years. He stopped at a flat bench partway down the hillside, where the slope briefly leveled before dropping again. "This bench is a gift," he said. "It catches water, gives it time to soak in. Every farm on this hill has a bench like this, but most people farm through it like it isn't there. I farm to it. I use it. The water that would run off the top half of the field settles here first. Then it moves slowly to the lower half. No concentrated energy. No rills." Melton was writing in his field notebook. He was writing fast. "The GPS measures elevation at a point," Otto said, watching Melton write. "That's useful. But water doesn't move between points. Water moves across the whole surface, following the path of least resistance. And that path depends on things that happened before the LiDAR survey and things that are happening right now, while the rain is falling. The only way to know that path is to be here when the rain falls, year after year, until you stop predicting and start recognizing." He looked at the wet slope for a moment, then back at Melton. "Water doesn't lie," he said. "Watch where it goes after a rain, and it will tell you everything about your field that no machine can measure." Melton went back to Des Moines and spent 3 months writing a report that he titled, carefully and with some internal resistance, "Limitations of DEM-based contour optimization in karst upland agricultural systems." The report documented the erosion events on the 4 Fillmore County installations, analyzed the systematic gap between DEM-calculated contour lines and observed surface water behavior, and proposed a set of field observation protocols drawn directly from Otto Breckner's methods that he called dynamic water path mapping. The core of the protocol was simple. Before implementing any GPS-guided row placement system on sloped ground with irregular subsurface drainage, an agronomist was required to make minimum 3 field observations following rainfall events of varying intensity, mapping observed surface water movement patterns against the proposed row placement, and adjusting the system plan to align with actual water behavior rather than modeled elevation data alone. It was, as Melton acknowledged in the report's introduction, a formalization of something that experienced farmers had been doing instinctively for generations. "The contribution of precision agriculture technology to this problem," he wrote, "is not to replace observational field knowledge, but to provide a quantitative framework within which such knowledge can be systematically recorded, shared, and integrated with computational optimization. The observational knowledge must come first. The technology follows." He sent the report to his company's research director, to 2 Iowa State colleagues, and, on an impulse, to the Agricultural Extension Office in Preston, Minnesota, with a note that Otto Breckner's name and address were included in the acknowledgments. The Extension Office forwarded the report to a soil conservation specialist named Barbara Thielen, who had been working in southeastern Minnesota for 11 years, and who had spent much of that career trying to communicate to precision agriculture vendors the specific challenges of karst terrain farming. She called Melton. She called Otto. She drove to the Breckner farm in March 2009 and spent 2 days walking the fields with Otto and taking detailed notes. What she found and what her subsequent field documentation confirmed was a topsoil management record that was, in her professional estimation, extraordinary. The Breckner fields showed a horizon depth consistently between 13 and 15 inches across the entire 160-acre operation, measured at 24 sample points in March 2009. The county average for fields of comparable slope and aspect in Fillmore County was 7.4 inches. The difference roughly double the county average topsoil depth represented. At conservative estimates, more than 70 years of avoided erosion. Based on USDA soil loss equations for the local slope class and rainfall regime, fields without contour management in Fillmore County's karst uplands were losing an average of 4.2 tons of topsoil per acre per year. At that rate, the Breckner fields should have been at 7 to 8 inches of A-horizon depth by 2008. They were at 14 inches. The difference was 50 years of curved rows. Thielen wrote a field report for the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources in September 2009 that included a section titled Empirical Contour Farming, Observational Methods in Karst Terrain. The section drew extensively on Otto's methods and quoted him directly. It reached the desk of a soil and water management faculty member at Iowa State University's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, who was at that time revising the curriculum for the department's second-year precision agriculture course. Her name was Dr. Patricia Voss, and she taught the course that Craig Melton had taken 19 years earlier. Dr. Voss drove to Fillmore County in the spring of 2010, bringing 2 graduate students and a soil sampling kit. She spent a week at the Breckner farm, measuring, photographing, and conducting the structured interviews that would eventually form the basis of a curriculum module she was developing. The module was titled Water Path Observation as a Prerequisite for Precision Field Planning, the academic formulation of a concept that Otto summarized in one sentence every time she tried to make it complicated. Watch the water. The water already knows. She included that sentence in the module's opening slide. She kept it there for every version of the course through 2024. Otto was not an easy interview subject. He was patient and generous with his time. But he was fundamentally skeptical of the idea that what he knew could be transferred through a curriculum rather than through years of wet mornings walking wet fields. He told Dr. Voss this directly, several times. "I can tell you what to look for," he said. "But what I'm actually doing when I look is not seeing the individual things I would tell you to look for. I'm seeing the whole field at once. The same way you can hear a song, you know, before you've consciously identified any of the notes. That part only comes from time. Nobody can teach it in a classroom." Dr. Voss wrote that down too. She put it in the module's closing section, under the heading, The Limits of Formalized Knowledge. The module's final assignment required students to spend 4 hours in the field following rainfall events before any computational analysis was permitted, and to submit field observation notes as a graded component of the Precision Agriculture Lab. The first cohort of students to complete the module, the Iowa State class of 2013, included 7 students who subsequently went into agricultural consulting. 3 of them later told Dr. Voss, independently and without being asked, that the 4 hours in the field had changed how they thought about their work more than any other component of the program. One of them was the student who had spent his field observation hours at a farm in northeastern Iowa and come back with mud on his boots and a notebook full of water path sketches that his supervising professor described as the most spatially intuitive field observation notes I've received in 15 years of teaching this course. His name was Andrew Melton. He was Craig's son. Craig did not know this when he received the email from Iowa State informing him that his field observations report had been incorporated into a teaching module. He called Dr. Voss. She told him about Andrew. There was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough for Dr. Voss to wonder if the call had dropped. "He never told me he was studying agriculture," Craig said finally. "He said he learned it from watching you walk fields," Dr. Voss said. Craig Melton drove back to Fillmore County that weekend. He stopped at County Road 4 and knocked on the door of the farmhouse with the covered porch and the kitchen garden along the south wall. Otto was in the kitchen having his morning coffee. He poured a second cup without being asked and set it on the table. They sat for a while without speaking, the way 2 men sit when the words are not the important part. "I owe you 4 farms worth of topsoil," Melton said eventually. "You can't pay it back," Otto said. "Topsoil doesn't come back in one lifetime. Just don't take any more." The Iowa State Curriculum Module, Water Path Observation, as a prerequisite for precision field planning, was formally adopted as a required component of the Agricultural Engineering undergraduate program in the fall of 2011. By By 2016, it had been adapted and incorporated into extension training programs in Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, reaching an estimated 1,400 agricultural consultants and extension agents across the four-state region. Craig Melton revised his company's installation protocol for karst terrain systems in 2010, making pre-installation water path observation mandatory for any operation on sloped ground with a karst geology designation. The revision added an estimated 2 to 3 days of field time per installation and reduced the per-farm revenue margin slightly. It also, in the 5 years following implementation, reduced erosion-related warranty claims on agri-tech installations by 73%. The company put that number in its marketing materials. They did not put Otto Breckner's name there, but Craig Melton kept his phone number in his wallet for years and called it every spring to ask how the fields looked after the snow melt. "The same," Otto always said. "The fields look the same." By 2024, Otto Breckner's 160 acres on County Road 4 had the deepest topsoil of any comparably sloped farm in Fillmore County. A soil survey conducted by the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources in 2022 measured the horizon depth at 14.2 inches, essentially identical to the 14 inches that had been recorded in Itzenjobe Arshaba, when Otto's grandfather had first walked the ground with a soil probe and a notebook. 94 years, 4 generations. One principle: watch the water. The farm passed to Otto's son Martin in 2019, when Otto was 88, and had reluctantly accepted that his knees would no longer permit him to walk the slopes in wet weather. Martin had grown up on the farm and had learned the method not from a curriculum module, but from standing beside his father in the rain, watching the same water move across the same ground, learning to see what his father saw. He did not use GPS guidance on the contour rows. He had considered it once and then decided against it for reasons he found difficult to articulate. But that had something to do with a phrase his father had repeated enough times across Martin's childhood that it had become a kind of background architecture of his thinking. Water doesn't lie. Watch where it goes after a rain, and it will tell you everything about your field that no machine can measure. Otto died in January 2021, 2 months after his 90th birthday, in the farmhouse where he had been born. He had never owned a GPS receiver. He had never used precision agriculture software. He had farmed 160 acres of some of the most erosion-prone ground in Minnesota for 63 consecutive years and left it, at the end of those years, in better condition than he had found it. His tools were a 1987 John Deere, a whetstone for the disc blades, a pair of rubber boots, and a willingness to stand in a wet field in October and watch where the water went. The curriculum module at Iowa State was updated in 2022 to include a brief biography of Otto in its introductory section. Dr. Voss, who had retired the previous year, wrote the biography herself. It ended with his photograph, a man standing at the edge of a field of curved rows in the late afternoon light of an October, in an unspecified year, looking downslope with the particular expression of someone who has been looking at the same thing for a very long time and has not yet finished learning from it. The caption read, Otto Breckner, 1931-2021, Fillmore County, Minnesota, 14 inches of horizon topsoil, from 1928 to 2022, unchanged. Beneath the photograph, in the margin of the curriculum PDF, someone, a student perhaps, or a teaching assistant had written in small handwriting, "Watch the water.